Hello folks, thank you for tuning in and welcome to our video lesson. I'm Alex Loktyanov, an Egyptologist from Christ's College, Cambridge, and today we will be going through the basics of reading ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So, here's the plan. We'll begin by talking a little bit about the different writing systems that were in use throughout ancient Egypt's long history, because it's important to bear in mind that, while hieroglyphs were really important, the Egyptians also had other means of communicating information. We'll then focus in on the most widely studied of these various writing systems, and that is indeed the hieroglyphic system. That system is made up of different categories of hieroglyph, and we're going to look at each of these in turn. Then we'll explore how you go about combining the different hieroglyphs to form words, before putting all of that knowledge together to actually go through the process of reading a simple Egyptian phrase. That will then set us up nicely for our second lesson, which focuses on Egyptian grammar and will allow us to make more sense of the language expressed by this remarkable writing system. But first things first, let's take a look at the different ways in which Egyptian could be written. The language had 4 key scripts, and our names for each of them come from ancient Greek. The scripts were hieroglyphic, derived from the Greek for sacred writing, hieratic, from the Greek word for priestly, demotic, from the Greek for popular, and Coptic, stemming from the Greek for Egyptian. Let's look at each one by one. First, hieroglyphs. Out of all the Egyptian scripts, the hieroglyphic script is obviously the most famous, and there are several reasons for that. One reason is because they are incredibly old, and carried on being used for a phenomenally long time. The oldest Egyptian hieroglyphs date to around 3150 BC, making them one of the oldest instances of writing anywhere in the world, and the system continued in use right up until around 400 CE. That's over 3,500 years, which is a world record. Another reason for the fame of hieroglyphs is that they are aesthetically the most impressive. They were designed primarily for carving in stone, rather than writing with a pen or brush. So you've got to be an artist to be able to use hieroglyphs effectively. Just being literate would not have been enough, and as a result, texts written in hieroglyphs don't usually suffer from bad handwriting. They're often very carefully carved and are sometimes skillfully painted too, making the text a work of art as well as a document. Why spend so much time and effort on hieroglyphs? Well, simply because to the Egyptians, they were no ordinary writing. Hieroglyphs were sacred, known as words of the gods in the Egyptian language. So if something has hieroglyphs written on it, that object becomes holy as well. In fact, the religious power of hieroglyphs was so strong that sometimes even linguistically meaningless strings of hieroglyphs could appear on cult objects, just to give them greater spiritual force. So, with this in mind, it isn't very surprising that the archaeological context in which hieroglyphs are most commonly found is in people's tombs, commemorating the deceased in a religiously potent way. They're not usually used in daily life. So, what was used for writing in daily life? It was the hieratic script, known as priestly to the Greeks because they noticed the Egyptian priests using it when writing documents for their day-to-day administration. This script also was incredibly long-lived, first appearing at roughly the same time as hieroglyphs, around 3100 BC, and continuing in use for over 3 millennia thereafter. However, unlike hieroglyphs, it wasn't designed to be a work of art, and did not have intrinsic sacred value. Instead, it it was designed to be written with a brush or a reed pen on a surface such as a papyrus or an ostracon, which is a fragment of broken pot used for writing. As it's supposed to be written with ink, rather than chiseled into stone, it's a cursive script. Scribes could join up the signs, therefore allowing them to write much more quickly, and you certainly didn't need to be good at art to be able to write hieratic. This relative ease of use meant that this was the Egyptian script which you would first be taught in an ancient Egyptian school, not hieroglyphs. Aspiring scribes started out by learning hieratic, and only a select few then went on to learn hieroglyphs. The number of texts written in hieratic is large, ranging from love poetry to legal proceedings, medical prescriptions to maths problems. But because the script is now considered less visually attractive, at least to our modern sensibilities, and because it's not as common in famous Egyptian tombs, it remains almost unknown outside the community of professional Egyptologists. Now that you've seen this talk, perhaps you can play your part in changing that, because hieratic was certainly important. Evolving from hieratic from around 650 BC, so relatively late on, we also have another Egyptian script known as Demotic, the popular script, according to the Greeks. It's not very popular with many Egyptology students today, though, because it's even more cursive than its hieratic predecessor, and therefore it's often difficult to puzzle out the handwriting of the scribes who wrote it. For the Egyptians, though, it offered an opportunity to write things down even more quickly than hieratic. We can think of it as a form of shorthand, and this therefore made it perfect for administrative documents such as receipts or tax records. This said, we also have to note that Demotic was deployed across the full spectrum of Egyptian writing and could be used for stories or religious texts as well as administration. It outlasted hieroglyphs and hieratic, but eventually stopped being used around 420 CE. By that point, Egyptian culture had changed profoundly. Egypt had become a Christian country and had been under Roman rule for over 4 centuries. This final phase of ancient Egyptian history, when it was a province of the Roman Empire and when Christianity was becoming increasingly important, is reflected in the fourth and final script that we'll mention today, Coptic. In contrast to all earlier Egyptian scripts, this one was an alphabet, based on Greek, with some extra signs thrown in to reflect sounds unique to Egyptian. This was a reflection of influence of Greek culture in Egypt at this time, which was a key feature of all provinces in the Eastern Roman Empire. While all kinds of documents could be written in Coptic, it is primarily associated with religious Christian writings. In fact, it continues to be used by Egyptian Christians to this day. Alright, so now that we've built up a general picture of writing in ancient Egypt, let's focus in on the hieroglyphs. If you were to study Egyptology at university, they would be the Egyptian script you would learn first, and so it makes sense for them to be the focus of this introductory talk too. There are 4 main types of hieroglyphs that we need to think about: uniliteral, biliteral and triliteral signs, and also, a bit different, determinatives. The uniliterals, biliterals and triliterals are all phonograms. This means they convey certain sounds. Determinatives, meanwhile, don't convey a particular sound, but rather a particular meaning, helping us to interpret phonograms. More on that later. First, let's look at the uniliteral or alphabetic signs, as they're the fundamental building blocks of the hieroglyphic script and are always the first thing you learn. From our perspective, as users of an alphabetic script ourselves, The logic behind these signs is really easy to understand. Each sign simply represents one sound. So, for instance, here on the screen we have an image of a hand, and that is the hieroglyph for the sound D. The key point to bear in mind is that it does not mean hand. That's one of the most common misconceptions about Egyptian. People think because it shows a hand, it must mean a hand. It doesn't. It just represents the sign D. Now, we might think that's a bit strange. Why draw a hand when you don't mean a hand and actually just mean D? But come to think about it, all alphabets use seemingly random symbols to represent particular sounds. Why is our rendering of D, a circle with a line coming off it, any less strange? It's just an abstract symbol, and it only means D because we as a society have collectively agreed to give it that value, and to then stick to the rules whenever we see that sign. It was the same for the Egyptians. Society accepted that a hand meant D, so that's what it meant. It's that simple. There are, however, a few extra things to consider, because the Egyptian alphabet wasn't quite like ours. First off, Egyptian does not write vowels. Not because it didn't have any, as all languages need vowels to be pronounceable, but because Egyptians were able to work out pronunciation just from looking at the consonants. It's worth noting that, if you look at your sign list, you'll see signs that appear to be vowels, pronounced as an or a y, for example. But that's more of a modern approximation to make things easier to pronounce for us, as in fact, these signs still represent a type of consonant that's just not present in English. To help with pronunciation even more, today we add an sound between Egyptian consonants, as you'll soon hear when we start looking at sentences. The key point to remember is that this is not necessarily an accurate reflection of how Egyptian sounded like. It's just a system we use today. As the actual vowels aren't written, the only thing we know for sure is what the consonants are. The second important thing to note is that Egyptian alphabetic signs occur very frequently alongside other types of sign. As we've said before, Egyptian, unlike English, doesn't rely solely on an alphabet to write its words. This means that, unfortunately, we can't just get away with learning the alphabetic signs. There are other types of sign coming up, which we'll need to master as well. We also need to bear in mind that even within the alphabet, while most Egyptian signs do map on fairly neatly to letters we have in English, there are a few that convey sounds for which we don't have an English letter. For these sounds, we use special characters. So what we call the aleph, a sound we pronounce like a short but which is actually a consonant, is written with two curved lines, one on top of another, a bit like a number 3. Another consonant, called the ayin, which we pronounce like a longer is written with a single curved line, like a small letter C in superscript. Then there are 3 extra H sounds, which are not present in English, in addition to just a normal H, similar to the one we have. These are written with a dot, a curvy line, and a straight line underneath them. We also have a sh sound, called a sheen, written as an S with an accent over it, a ch sound marked as an underlined T, and the j sound denoted by an underlined D. You can look up all of these signs in your sign list. Let's move on now from the alphabetic signs to biliteral signs. As the name suggests, these are signs which convey 2 sounds, 2 consonants at once. Of course, the question that immediately comes to mind is, why do we need them? After all, you can use the alphabet to write any combination of sounds. For instance, if you wanted to write sesh, a very important word in Egyptian, it conveys the idea of writing, you could just do this. You could use the alphabetic sign for sir, the bolt, the alphabetic sign for sheen, the pool, and there you have it, sesh. But that's not what you do. Instead, sesh is simply written with this sign. This might seem needlessly complicated to us, but having biliterals like this presented many advantages to the Egyptians. Firstly, by reducing two signs to one, you make the process of writing quicker, and you potentially also take up less space. Bearing in mind that you're probably chiseling this from stone, that means that you save valuable resources. Alongside this, there's also a stylistic aspect. By having these biliterals, you add greater variation and artistic sophistication to the hieroglyphic script. As we said, hieroglyphs were an art form as well as just a form of writing, so appearances mattered. Finally, we mustn't forget the fact that while the presence of these extra signs might have made the writing system more convoluted than strictly necessary, that was not necessarily a bad thing from an ancient Egyptian perspective. Unlike our society, ancient Egypt was not a world that aspired to a high literacy rate, and so it wasn't particularly interested in making learning to read and write especially easy. If you came from an elite family, you would have the time and resources to learn the complex system anyway, and if you didn't, you weren't really expected to learn at all. So to the Egyptians, having these extra signs made very good sense. Following on in the same vein, we have triliterals, where a single hieroglyph represents a string of 3 consonants. So for instance, take the word mut, the Egyptian word for mother. You could theoretically write it like this: owl for an M, quail chick for a W, bread loaf for a T. But you wouldn't do that. Instead, you use a triliteral sign, this vulture, which conveys the sound mut all in one go. The arguments for doing so are exactly the same as the ones we've already discussed in relation to biliterals. And you can look up some of the most common biliterals and triliterals in your sign list. Okay, that leaves us with just one more category of hieroglyph: determinatives. These work in a rather different way. To help us get our heads around them, let's go back to thinking in English for a moment. Suppose we wrote English without vowels, like we do Egyptian, and we wanted to differentiate between the 3 words car, care, and cure. If we write out all 3 of them without vowels, they look absolutely identical. We can't tell which is which. So what can we do, assuming we can't use vowels? Well, how about adding a little picture after each of the words to give the reader an idea of what we're talking about? So maybe we could have a car to denote that the first set of consonants means car, a little hand and heart to show that the second set of consonants stands for care, and maybe a medical syringe representing a cure in the final example. So by adding these pictures, we can now distinguish the words once again, while the presence of the consonants is still necessary because it tells us which particular word is being used. You can't have a picture of a car on its own, for example, because that could just as easily stand for some other word, such as taxi or vehicle. We can take this one step further. If we add a little picture of a person after each of our examples, what happens? So, for instance, the first of our examples might now mean a person connected to a car, so maybe a driver. The second is perhaps a carer, somebody who cares. And the third is maybe a doctor, someone who cures. Clearly, this is a very rough and ready system, but I hope it gets the point across. We can spell out our original word in consonants and then add extra signs to it to distinguish it from other words and to refine its meaning more closely. Let's now apply this to Egyptian. If we go back to one of the words we had earlier, sesh, we said it could be expressed by this biliteral sign and that it conveys the idea of writing. But which of these two means a thing which is written, a document, and which means a person who writes, a scribe? To determine which is which, we need a determinative. So now we can clearly see that the first sesh is a document, marked out by the book roll, and the second is a scribe, marked out by the person. And in fact, we can go further. Use a determinative of a woman, and it's clear that we have a female scribe. Or a determinative of a god, and it's a divine scribe. Or even a determinative of a cat, and we have a feline scribe. A bit unlikely, maybe. But it's important to note, though, that the actual word sesh remains unchanged. The determinatives are determining meaning, but in and of themselves, they don't add any consonants. Another useful thing to know is that sometimes you get a single stroke after a determinative. Here's an example. It's the Egyptian word for man, which is simply sa. We've got the alphabetic sign giving the reading, the determinative confirming that the meaning is in fact a man, and the stroke afterwards. The stroke is basically saying that the determinative should be taken to mean whatever it is a picture of, in this case, simply a man. Here, that's kind of obvious, but you can imagine a case where this determinative is used as part of a larger word, such as we saw with scribe in the earlier example. In that case, the stroke isn't used, because the man determinative doesn't simply mean a man. It means something a bit more complex, namely a man who's involved in writing. This having been said, it's worth highlighting that these single strokes are incredibly common in Egyptian writing, and their use is not always very consistent. Sometimes they're simply used as space fillers, where there would otherwise be an ugly gap beside or beneath another hieroglyph. Again, this links to hieroglyphs being an art form. Writing has got to look pretty, and this means avoiding unnecessary spaces wherever possible. Okay, so we've now covered all the basic types of Egyptian hieroglyphs and how they are used. But there's one extra complication, the so-called phonetic complements. To get the hang of these, let's go back to another Egyptian word which we already know, the word for mother, mut. We said earlier that it could be written either with the vulture triliteral or with 3 alphabetic signs, which would be rather unlikely. But in actual fact, the way the word is usually written is with a combination of these 2 writings. So we get the triliteral, and then tagged onto the end of it, we have 1 or sometimes even 2 signs from its alphabetic writing. These signs complement the sounds already covered by the triliteral and should not be read separately. Hence, the word we see here is still mut and not mutat. Why did the Egyptians do this? It's hard to be certain, but it might be to do with how words were pronounced, with the phonetic complements highlighting the consonants which were emphasized in speech. From a stylistic perspective, having these extra signs could be useful too, as you could use them to plug any holes in the line of hieroglyphs. So for instance, in the example here, if we just had the vulture without the bread loaf, and it was part of a longer line of hieroglyphs, just behind the head of the vulture, there would most likely be an empty space. That's not very attractive artistically, but if you put the phonetic complement in, all of your space is used up. That's why Egyptian usually ends up being written in neat rows of texts where the writing is consistently the same height. As we look at more examples, you'll gradually get a better sense of how that layout works. So, now let's put all of our knowledge together and come up with a formula for how you write an Egyptian word. There are basically three elements. The main phonogram, which is the main sign indicating what consonants are being used, and which is often a biliteral or triliteral, any phonetic complements going after it, and determinatives refining the meaning at the end. Of course, some very short words might not have all of these, but this formula represents the general rule. When you see new Egyptian words, try to divide them up into these different components to help you figure out what's going on. So, for instance, if we apply this formula to the full writing moot, we can clearly see our main phonogram, the triliteral, the phonetic complement behind it, and the determinative of a woman at the end. Together, these three signs, all doing slightly different things, make up the whole word. While we still have moot up on the screen, we can also add another important topic, and that's the direction in which the Egyptians wrote. Unlike English, Egyptian didn't have one set direction in which text always had to be written. You could quite legitimately write left to right or right to left. The rule for working out which way to read an Egyptian text is that the signs always face the opposite direction to the one in which you're reading. So you're always reading into the sign. In this case, we are reading left to right. But it would be equally legitimate to flip the word around, in which case we would need to read from right to left. Again, there'll be opportunities to practice. So, let's now put everything together. We now know what Egyptian words are made up of, but the process of actually reading them in a sentence is made up of various stages. Let's summarize them. First, we work out the direction in which to read, always reading into the sign. Then, we look at the line of text and try to separate out the words. Egyptian has no spaces or punctuation, so we have to look at the signs to see where one word ends and the next one begins. This is why it's important to remember that the signs conveying sounds come at the start of a word, and determinatives come at the end. So when we see a determinative, chances are that a new word will be starting soon after it. Once we've separated the words out, we can then transliterate. Transliteration is the process of writing out the sounds of the hieroglyphs using English letters or the various special characters that we discussed earlier. Writing out a transliteration means other people can quickly see what words we've got in our text, how they're divided up, and what grammatical constructions might be involved. We then translate the individual words and finally start thinking about the grammar. How do these words fit together? All right, so let's take an example using words we know. First, we work out the direction in which we read. Here, it's going to be right to left. Then, we split the sentence up into constituent words. Both words have clear determinatives at the end, so it's nice and easy. Now that we've got our words, we transliterate. Sesh is the first word, and moot is the second. Now, let's translate the individual words, and we get scribe, mother. But that's not quite a full translation yet. We've got the words, but we're not really sure how they fit together. What does scribe, mother mean? Is it a scribe and a mother? Scribe of a mother? Or a scribe or a mother? Something else? Perhaps because this is a small fragment of a larger sentence? In this case, we can't be sure, because this is such a tiny fragment. But by learning some Egyptian grammar, we can at least get a grip on some basic rules that govern relationships between different words, and start to construct meaning in slightly longer Egyptian sentences. That's going to be our task in the second video. It's time to learn some grammar. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this online introduction to Egyptian. Thank you.